Hi, welcome back. Question for the day comes again from Gabriel on YouTube, and it was from a ways back. So at least I think it was, and which is why I'm going to go after it before I go after some other guys who've come more recently, some other people's questions. But Gabriel on YouTube is just asking a straight up question: what is the center of interest? You could get enormously expansive, depending on whether you mean as it pertains to creating a still life or looking at pictures or other things. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of thinking about this, and they could take time in many directions. But I think the most important thing that somebody working as in any kind of a beginning or even middle phase of painting wants to know, and is how in the world do you what? Well, how do you organize a picture? Everything we're talking about, center of interest, it's just about organization. Organization means that something has to be dominant. That's all it means. And, when I use that expression, I go back to the Agatha Christie story. She would figure out her climax, and then she would decide what would happen first, second, third, and whatever else to get us all to that climax that she wanted us to enjoy. So the center of interest is very interesting this way to the viewer, and the viewer doesn't know this. Most painters will not accept this as being true. And by the way, everything I say is my opinion and my experience. So don't assume that I'm this, and I even think of myself as this special guy. I'm just simply telling you what I've found. And in this area, in the question of the area of interest, I have discovered that my eyes, for example, when I go into the museum, or when I just walk into a room, my eyes tend toward say in the picture, that tends toward that area that is dominant, that is different from all the rest. Corot used to think of it or talk about it as this brightest spot of light. It's sort of like that in a certain way, except it doesn't matter in one sense whether that's what it is or not. Typically, because it has so much importance, it will tend to be also important in terms of the amount of light it has. But the center of interest is that place to which your eye is attracted first. And that's simply what I've discovered. And I found that organizing pictures is way, 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 way simpler when you figure out what that is. It's so easy and typical of a student to come in, we've all done it, and actually have two centers of interest and not have any idea what that means. Why? What is that? Well, no, I chose this to be my center, they will say. And then I will point out to them that if you look at the thing big, if you take in the thing as a whole, aren't these two centers equal? Well, equality is the enemy of interesting, shall we say. This equals that is like pretty boring, but the irregularity, dominance, and everything else being subdominant or down to being just add-on, is a big deal in painting. And so you start when you look at a picture with that area, and that really begins to inform you about how to, what you should be doing in your own picture. But again, when you walk into a room or just frame, I was going to say, if you just hold up your hands and frame a section of a room, you will see, and just say, now what's the center of interest? I suggest strongly that you blur your eyes. There'll be an area that maintains its differentiation from the generality of the rest. It'll be the biggest and, in a sense, valuistically strongest spot. And that's a simple way of defining the center of interest. In the old days, the center of interest was what we chose to be the center of interest. For example, you would put a figure of God up high, or a figure of Jesus up high, and everybody else would be in a lower position. And, well, those would be really orders of ranking, so I should probably back away from that. But there's something like that in terms of interest. So you create make your figures, the one that's most interesting, by the way its pose is made. Well, there's all kinds of ways of getting interesting. But the center of interest, once you become an impressionist, once you're just an eyeball guy, is entirely about where the chief effect is in a picture. That's the center of interest. So let's just talk about aspects of centers of interest. I mean, the center of interest, and what makes interest is a big question, right? So what makes interest? Sharp edges, high contrast, in combination especially, right? High chroma makes stronger interest than weaker chroma. Busyness over flatness. Busy areas attract your eye. So if you think of it as in terms of attractiveness, you're really on to what makes interesting, right? And people will actually kill the interesting in the interest of unity. Well, you can't. You actually have to figure out how to organize your interestings. The unity comes out of the differences, right? The unity isn't even a meaningful term if you don't have a variety of kinds of interest. So you're looking for how these things hang together, and yet there's this dominance of one area. And when you put anything else into the picture, no matter where it is, it refers back to that center in one way or another. There's a whole discussion in certain books on painting that you expect wherever you are in a picture for it to be referential, so your eye will naturally go back through the center again. Some people will say the lines will point through the center. Well, there's a continuity of lines. I don't want to get into that. It's a longer discussion. That has to do with the unity idea, and we're talking about the interesting part. But it is interesting, by the way, to separate those two, like really dramatically in your own mind. You're either trying to be interesting at a certain point. That's the problem with your picture. It's not that interesting. Or you're trying to be unified. Oh, the problem is it's chaotic, right? You get to a certain point of interesting and you're in pure chaos. So you just try to get to a place where where you could say, well, now that's interesting, right? From across the room, that's interesting. I got to go over and look at that, which is what you want to do. You sort of want to get your viewer, if you look at it, stand in the middle of a room in a museum, which you really should do, and glance around the room, the guy who gets your attention, by whatever means, is the guy that you probably will, if you do that first, you'll probably walk over to that one that you found most interesting when you didn't even know what the subject was. You'll just walk over there. I know that most of us will walk into a museum and they'll look for where the Titian is, But it's not really the greatest plan when you're trying to understand this kind of an idea. Now, I made a few notes and I want to make sure that I haven't missed anything. Let's see. What else is interesting? Yeah, I think I've largely covered it. Let's see if there's anything else. One thing I think is worthy of your time if you're actually trying to set up a still life. Make sure you say to yourself, what kinds of things are interesting? And I do mean visually interesting. Make that list, make it complete so you can notice why, not just that, but why. And that for example, you can have an area that's busy, it's very busy, and you'll have a hard time figuring out whether it's more interesting than this area that's very rich. And you'll find yourself, if you find yourself with a division, a split interest, in terms of saying, in terms of knowing where to start in a picture, that's not a good thing. So at that point, for example, you might consider bringing some of that best chroma right into the center so that we don't have this competition, so the center even has the best of that. But you don't have to worry about that unless the center is actually, complaining, if it's actually weakened by the presence of this strong player outside. Sometimes a stronger light will do that. Just one glary light in some odd place can just do serious damage to that center area, no matter how interesting that center area is. So, but I go through a list like complexity is more interesting than simplicity, that sharp edges, high contrast, high chroma. Broken color is more interesting, more attractive in a certain way, unless it gets so broken that it's just confusing. But I'm talking about side-by-side colors setting each other off in a dramatic way. But texture is more interesting than non-texture. An area of interest, like the center of interest, if it has the list of things that are characteristic of pictures, like it has good pattern, that is just shape, cut out shape, silhouette, you might say, and if it has good form, and it has strong chromas, and it has busyness, you see where I'm going? So those are those things that make for interesting. And that area that dominates is the one that has you might argue, and this is a simplistic way of talking about it, but you might argue that it's the area that has the most of the most, right? The most of the best of those things, right? However, you just look at it. You're setting something up, you just look at it with your eye. If it owns the area, you've done the first part of your job. And then if you keep finding yourself in conflict with somebody who's weaker, trying to dominate. I say to a student, by the way, just create a really strong center of interest so that nothing you do in the rest of say if you had a still life sitting on a table, nothing you do anywhere else can even begin to compete with it. That's called a winning company. Now you could argue, well, I'm trying to make a very quiet picture. Well, it's still the same thing. Whatever you choose for your center, make it as dominant as you can. Give it most of the best, right? And then make sure that nobody else gets past that level of interest, and you'll be just fine. That's a strategy, if you want to call that a procedure. So yeah, I think that covers it. And thank you very much for that question, Gabriel.